I'm here today for another bonus episode of the Echo Leadership Podcast. I'm with Sean Morgan. He is the founder of the Ascent Leader and has made a huge impact on so many different leaders, church leaders, has a phenomenal story. I'm thrilled that you're hanging out with us today.
It's good to be here.
So, Sean, tell us a little bit about your story. I know that you're a Bay Area native and you have been spending a lot of time in this region influencing leaders for many years.
Yeah, it's a crazy story. I mean, my parents both, finished high school here, went to Cal Poly. So I was born here, just a few miles from where the Echo Church is, and did a lot of growing up in Colorado, but God brought us back here through military service to a big Air Force base out here in California back in the late 90s, and then a trajectory into ministry after that. So it wasn't part of the plan that I thought I was moving toward, but it was certainly right where God wanted us.
So you moved back in 98?
98.
For
Yep.
Air Force? And
Yep.
Were you married at the time already?
No, we got married in 99.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you spent close to 20 years up in the Fairfield, Vacaville area.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit about that story, how you kind of got rolling in vocational ministry at that point.
Yeah, well, again, it wasn't by any strategy or intentionality. I grew up in the church, and really, I didn't have a crisis of faith in high school and my college years, but I began to question how healthy the local church was. And I just wrestled with a few stories and a few people where I saw people hurting. One of them was a divorce, and another one was just somebody that was making bad decisions. And instead of the church that I was a part of really rallying around and supporting these people, they were sort of outcast. And so what I struggled with as a teen was seeing a church in somebody's hour of need, a church distance themselves from that person. And I was like, that's not the story of grace that I see in Jesus. So I didn't have a crisis of faith as much as I did my understanding of the church just bewildered me. And so through those years, there's a couple more stories bolted onto that, that I just struggled I wasn't in a church community. I wasn't really following Jesus. But the Air Force brought us here in 98. And I just really had a sense like, you need to wrestle with this issue. And I was part of a church plant in Colorado. Didn't really know it was a church plant. It was just church when you're in first grade or whatever. It's just church. But that sense of entrepreneurship and doing something fresh and new and energy around a gathering of people was something that drew me back in. And so when we moved here to California, I got plugged into a church that really was shutting down. I call it a church plant, but behind the scenes, it was shutting down a dying church that was not reaching who the community had become. And so it was an enclave, a remnant that wasn't relevant to the neighbors. And so launching into a new church plant out of that called New Life Church, which is in Fairfield and Vacaville up in California. And so got involved in lay leadership. And I still remember the day my pastor, Pastor John, who's really just a spiritual father to me, asked me out to lunch at a Mexican restaurant in Fairfield, California. I was like, oh, pastor wants to go out to lunch. Like, this will be cool. And just spend some time with him. And he looked me in the eye and said, I think God's calling you to come be the executive pastor at this church. And out of nowhere. First of all, I didn't know what an executive pastor was. And so I laughed. I'm at this table eating a burrito or an enchilada or something. And I laughed. And within 30 seconds, I cried.
Wow.
And I cried because I basically sensed the Holy Spirit saying, you're going to have to wrestle with your plan for your life. And it might mean letting go of things that you think are important, like positions and titles and salaries and those types of things. And that's why I cried, because it freaked me out.
Talk about that journey from that point forward. Like, how long did you wrestle through that before you actually were signed on to his team?
Yeah, it was a year. Were
you in turmoil that whole time?
Not initially. It was easy initially just to sort of like brush it off. But probably about the 6-month point, we just agreed we would always be open in conversation to like, let's keep talking. And that didn't mean anything for a few months. But about the 6-month point, I sensed I had to start wrestling again. And it came to a head one night. I just, like, God would not let me go. And I was up pretty much the whole night, and actually drove down to the beach and just spent most of the night with the waves. And I just came to a place of surrender, going, I need to say yes to God and worry about that, not the results.
Wow.
The results are up to him.
So now looking back, that's like what, 20 years ago?
Yeah. That was probably about 17 years ago. Yeah.
So what part of that giving up to step into this new calling has been most challenging for you?
I don't even think I can answer that, because I want to say, like, oh, like leaving finances, income, security behind. It hasn't been. My wife has been just massively supportive and trusting, and ultimately just going, like, yeah, this makes me nervous, but I sense God is in it, and he's always taking care of us. So I don't have one regret, not one day since then. If I have a regret, it's why did it take me so long to say yes?
Well, I can imagine a lot of leaders have those pivot moments in their life where they get a sense internally, like there's something more that maybe God's stirring. There's something I'm supposed to do. And maybe even like right now, there's somebody that's listening to this that's in that place. What would you say to that person who's wrestling? And it doesn't even have to be vocational ministry. It's just like, all right, I'm all in to follow whatever it is that God is asking me to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that, because it doesn't have to be vocational ministry, and more often than not won't be, quite honestly. I think the core, so I believe if you really pause and listen to God and trust your intuition, most people know the right answers. What makes making the decision and doing the right thing is all the noise, all the things that all the stories we start telling ourselves, and all the things we convince ourselves of. So I think you have to really answer questions like, if you feel a prompting from God for doing anything, like, what's at the core of that? And if it's advancing you, you have to ask yourself again, is that me or is that God? Because oftentimes what God asks us to do is humbling, is letting go of things and taking risks. So if it's, like, I've heard people say, well, I've got this promotion, I've been praying about doing these things. I've even heard people talking about, praying about, starting something that's missional, or creating something that's very missional. It doesn't have to be inside a local church, but ministry focused, missional minded things. But I just got this big promotion at work, and it's going to be 50% raise in salary, and it's such an honor. So I really feel like God's calling me to do that. And I'm like, so a title and money. That's how you think God calls you? Like, maybe, totally, maybe. I get it. But that's not a black and white thing. And so I think really going, well, what's it, why? Why does more money have to be what God's calling you to? And so I think if you're really honest with yourself, this is what I feel like God may be tugging. Ask yourself why, and is it more about you or more about what God wants to do through you? And if you could develop those lists, I think it'll be pretty convincing at the end of, a few months of prayer and discernment. And I would also say, loop other people in. Don't go on that journey alone, right? Bring your spouse, bring your family, bring people who know you and love you and want God's best for you into the loop, and let them pray for you, let them lift you up, and let them even, speak into it. God uses other people to speak to you. That is one of the ways God communicates. And so listen to what other people have to say. And if it's something you're horrible at, it's probably not it. Like, God gives gifts and equipping where he calls.
Yeah, so that's good. And I think too, one thing that's really fascinating is a lot of times people are afraid to say yes because there's a fear of what that yes actually means. And sometimes it's like you say yes to God and he sends you right back into what you were doing, but now you have a greater sense of purpose. And like you were saying, it's not about you anymore.
Absolutely.
And I've seen that a lot with business leaders. It's like, it's the same company, but the company takes on, or the organization takes on, more meaning and more significant. I love how God's made you in this way where you kind of have this bent towards administration, system, structure, kind of strategy, coming alongside your senior leader, that whole story. Talk about that journey as well. Like, so now you step in, you say yes, and you start helping your pastor, but it doesn't go really well at first, right? There's kind of a initial surprise, like, oh, maybe the changes that we made didn't work. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I do want to point out, I mean, we got a chance to talk about your journey on Leaders in Living Rooms podcast, and you talked about the heart of your ministry calling being around your friends and the relationship that meant something. These are real people you know and understand. And that was a part of my calling is I saw my lead pastor's giftedness, and I also saw some areas where, and he knew as well, I mean, he was really the one that pointed them out and said, these are the things I'm not good at. You can help me in these areas. And so it was really a way where I could do something. You hear, I think it's an Andy Stanley phrase or something, but only do what only you can do. Well, when you get pulled away from that, you're doing what others can do. And it's often what you're not either A, gifted in, or B, passionate about, or both. And let's face it, in ministry, you got to do a few of those things,
Right.
but you shouldn't be doing a lot of those things. And so part of what I said yes to was coming to just help him. Because I cared about him and I cared about his longevity, not only his success today, but his longevity in ministry. And so picking up the torch in a few areas was an important part of that call. But yeah, we had grown the church from a church plant to a little under 1,000. But it was artificial. We were doing things that were sort of propping up or injecting steroids to keep the church, the numbers, the attendance numbers, if you were to count those. But we didn't have the healthy structure underneath to support it. So those things weren't resting on well-supported parts of an organization. And over time, you'll get decay, right? So you often hear a phrase like, you are getting out of your organization precisely what it is designed to do. So if you don't like the results, you got to go back and look at where that's coming from. And for us, that decay started coming, and we started really a downward attendance trajectory where we almost went down by about 50%. But some of that was deliberate. We were making some decisions about how do we get healthier as a church. And so we had to stop doing things that were in some cases extra attractional and spending extra money on certain events that weren't really bearing ministry fruit, but were allowing some attendance-driven numbers to go up. And when we did that, we went down by about 50%. But by God's blessing, the giving stayed the same or even went up. And so we were able to address some of the areas that we really felt like this isn't a part of the church that can move the church forward, that can help make disciples, whether we're talking about family ministry, kids, youth, all those types of things. So we really got into the details and started addressing those things. And we grew the church downward for a number of years, but the health was there. The feeling was God is going to be blessing what we are doing, but we've got to really face the music. We've got to be willing to admit that some of the things we've done that got us here are not things that we believe are part of a healthy church, and we want to address those before we go any further.
Yeah, and there's a ton of change management and all of that, right? So you're like having difficult conversations, you're making difficult decisions.
Yeah.
And you learned a lot in that process, but some of that came out of a previous journey that you had where you were working in healthcare and you had done change. Talk about some of the big lessons you learned in change management and some of the landmines that maybe leaders, whether it's an entrepreneur or a church leader, that they step on in the process of making those like cataclysmic big changes to an organization.
Yeah. Well, I think every change agent, every change management leader, you really want to see progress, right? You see what could be on the other side. You see the opportunity. Probably the number one failure of change management leaders is to understand that at the end of the day, you're leading people. And one of the definitions of leadership that I learned early on in my military career is helping people get inspired to do things that they normally wouldn't be doing on their own and to like it. But the key word in there is people, right? You're helping people. You're not just building systems and doing other things. You're helping people. And there is a rate of change that people need to be able to get behind. And there's a rate of change that people almost can't get behind. And so I think it's important for leaders to understand it's a standard bell curve deal. There are people who are on board with change almost for the sake of change. And that's the early side of the bell curve. They call them early innovators. And then you get a little bit larger, you get another 5 or 7%, I think, when you start talking about early adopters. Mm-hmm. And then you start getting into the early majority. And at that point, when you have the early majority, you've got the front half of the organization, the church, whatever it is, the church body. And so when you're dealing with change management, you have to understand that there's a back half to that curve of people who aren't interested in change for the sake of change. And so I think that there are people you are going to be on board for the sake of change. Those are not the people that you have to convince. Mm-hmm. There are like the mild skeptics who they're not totally against it, but they're not convinced. And so as a change agent, you really have to be familiar with who are those people. And if you're in a church over 200 people, you're going to influence those people through secondary relationships. Mm-hmm. So you have the biblical term, there's leaders of tens, leaders of 50s, hundreds, and thousands. And so you kind of have to look and say, who are the leaders of hundreds that if they're on board, 100 other people are on board? Maybe not today. And so the way you make change is ultimately through influence. It's ultimately through your influence and the influence of others. And there's a couple different change management pathways. If you're dealing with change in your organization, the change management book that's really a go-to book is called Leading Change by John Kotter. And it's got it's fairly simplistic, but it's tried and true and proven. But I would say work with people in your church who have led change and rally them around you. That's sort of like rallying the influence base and let them help you. I learned so much in healthcare that I thought had to do with healthcare and change management, bringing technology into the process of healthcare in order to reduce errors. But God was using those seasons to help me understand the influence of others and change management and leadership that I never thought those seeds were being planted to help bear fruit in the church.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So when you come back to that whole healthcare, how did you actually go about changing like a doctor's behavior, or was it you would try to go into a specific office or a region?
Yeah, so primarily where I worked was at UC Davis Medical Center. Okay. And this was really like the flagship electronic medical record project. So it was at the time was a $200 million electronic medical record installation. And it was one of the largest in the country. And the guy who architected that is a guy named Dr. Tom Tinsman, is just a certifiable genius, knew so much about technology and healthcare and technology architecture, but he also knew a lot about people. And you take one of the key things that Dave Ramsey talks about when you pay down your debt is achieving early wins. You don't just pay down your debt to pay down your debt. We're human. We want to get a couple victories, a couple early wins. So you pay down your smallest debt, even though the smallest dollar amount might have a lower interest rate than paying down another one. So mathematically, you would say, well, pay down that higher percentage rate. But Dave says, no, you got to understand, if that's a year for you to get your first win, it's going to decimate your morale. So get a win underneath your belt. Pay down that smallest balance, that credit card with $300 on it, or get that one and then cut it up and get that win. And Tom understood that in healthcare. How do we help people get early wins? Especially, some of the most powerful people in the healthcare system are tenured professors if you're in a teaching institution. And so they tend to be older. And they look at their retirement trajectory and they go, I don't want to do anything new. I got to buy myself 3 more years and I'm out of here. And so they're going to be resistant. So I think one of the genius things that we did was we help understand that people need to understand the win and be incentivized, not necessarily personally, but incentivized to move toward that win. And there's 2 key ways you do that. You can get rid of the old and replace it with the new. That's pretty quick. That's like rip off the Band-Aid. But you can also build something new and leave an existing pathway or workflow or architecture in place, but help people understand the benefits of working with something new and really getting their buy-in. And so those are really the two key pathways, I guess. But the core of it is understanding at the end of the day, it's working with people and it's influencing people because they have a choice.
Mm-hmm. How do you discern between those two paths? The one where you just
the
rip
Band-Aid.
Yeah.
I would say that's really good. I should probably sit down and think a little bit more about it, but a couple of the key things. So if there's toxicity,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have a choice. Like you have to remove something that is causing dysfunction or toxicity into an organization. So that would certainly be one aspect. The other thing is it costs more chips.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to ask yourself as a leader, how many chips do I have, right? So if you're a brand new lead pastor and your predecessor's recently retired, you got some honeymoon chips.
Mm-hmm.
You want to use them for that, right?
Yeah.
Right? Or, you're 10 years down the road. You've got so many chips in the bank, you could say, we just need to do that. Let's make that change. Communication is still going to be an important part of it, but you can make that change. So I think you also have to ask, of the leaders of hundreds and leaders of thousands, how many of those people are attached to the old,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That has to be a variable. So I'd say those are probably the first three variables, but there's probably 5 or 6. But
Yeah.
those would be the weightiest ones.
Yeah. One that I was thinking about as you were talking is, what is the cost of, if you're going to do the other approach where you have two things going at once, what's the cost of keeping the other thing going? Whether it's mindset, finances, because, we've done some mergers and acquisitions, and there are some things that you immediately get rid of, and there are some things that you just kind of keep going that long term they're going to change, but the amount of resource that it's required to keep it going. And I love the toxicity question, because if it's toxic and it's cancer, you got to get rid of it as quick as possible.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's come now to culture, because I think this is another huge aspect of what you have leaned into. Like, so now you're doing several things. You're doing a podcast called Leaders in Living Rooms. You're like working with a lot of leaders, and you do cohorts with pastors. And a lot of what you're focused on, you got church leaders that are doing transitions. You have some that are learning how to be better communicators. Talk a little bit about the whole aspect of culture being such a significant component of transition and change, and how does a leader over time build a culture or a new culture?
Yeah, from a transition standpoint, I think, one of the best things that you can do as a transitions leader is understand that you're going to inherit a lot of things that you don't understand fully. Culture's one of them. There's going to be norms and values and expectations that you don't understand fully. Like, you're going to inherit a church, you know that. You're going to inherit a board, you know that. You're going to inherit executive team and staff, you know that. But there's a lot that you don't understand yet and don't see clearly. So I think one of the best things with culture is think of yourself as a bridge builder. And so one of the best advice that you can do early on comes from a friend, Judd Wilhite, who inherited a church that Gene Apple led in Las Vegas, grew to 4,000 or 5,000, so very large church about 15 years ago. And Judd came in there, and he will tell you, if you're not dealing with dysfunction and toxicity, listen, love, and learn. Those are the things you do early on. So I think when you set culture, one of the reasons why you listen, love, and learn is it shows a value. It shows a value for, I understand that I can learn a lot about the way things are here. And the love aspect of it shows appreciation a little bit. There's a pastoral side to that, but there's also an appreciation that, look, however much change we need, the truth is we never would have got to where we are today if it wasn't for the people who carried the weight to get us here. Was it a perfect journey? I know so many pastors that have stepped into a lead pastor role, like even following their father. And guess what? Your dad wasn't perfect. You're going to inherit some things that are messy. Your successor will, mine will. We're all human. And so I think that you just have to paint the picture that for leaders that you're going to inherit in this journey things that you don't like, things that are messy. But one of the things about culture is you have to show people value and appreciation, respect and honor in situations like that. Most of those people want to get on board with health of the organization, of the church. But it's going to be a lot harder for them to get on board if they don't feel like you've listened, if you've appreciated the work that got them there. And, and you work in all sorts of different situations with churches where people want to resist change. The culture is more focused on maybe inside. Mm-hmm. We've become attached to the methods again, and we like things this way. But at the end of the day, most of those people, not all of them, good shepherds still have to take out a wolf every now and then, right? But most of those people, they want what's best. You just got to help them move there. So I think one of the things with culture that you have is honor, respect, and appreciation. You don't have to agree with somebody to honor, respect, and appreciate them. Craig Rochelle talks about different kinds of feedback. You can appreciate somebody's effort while still helping them understand that the performance aspect is not there yet.
Yeah.
Right. And everybody, you can still appreciate the effort and the person. The truth is that if you want to change culture, you can go in and cash in different chips and you can change things, but you will probably not change culture that way. Mm-hmm. You can change something that way, but it probably won't be culture because culture is more affected by the heart than it is a system.
That's good, man. Yeah. One of the phrases Sam Chan, one of my mentors, uses. He says, "All change is a critique of the past." Mm-hmm. And early on in ministry, one of the things that I did in my leadership is, in efforts to get things to change for the future, I would bash what was before. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, we're not doing this anymore. We're doing this.
Right.
And what I learned very quickly is like every time I do that with the past,
right.
Anything I'm bashing is something somebody else built. Mm-hmm. And so now I can honor the past and move to the future. And I think some of it is just immaturity. You're thinking, well, if it's not good for the future, then it's got to be really, really bad. But it was good to get us to where we are. It's just not the right thing to take us where we need to go. And that shift in mindset has been so, so helpful. Yeah. I want to drill down one layer further into the health of leaders. And I've come to believe over time, like you can have a healthy organization without a healthy leader for a time, but not for a long time. And in your experience in working with leadership teams, what are some of the top practices that you see in leadership teams or leaders that are leading healthy organizations and they're still focused on their mission? So they're bringing the two of those together. It's not an either or, it's a both and, but they're living in that world of mission and health at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. I would even say like health and high performance, right? So mission accomplishment, high performance. And I think so often we can get focused on health at the expense of high performance. But the opposite is also true.
Yeah.
Right. We can get focused on high performance at the expense of health. And the bill always comes due. Mm-hmm. The bill will always come due. So you have to have both. You've got to have health and high performance. And I think some of the things there for me would be, there's always going to be an aspect of accountability and availability of leaders. Now that's not infinite. You have to guard your time and manage your time, but there's also insulation and isolation that is not healthy. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing I'll say with that is there's no system that will solve problems of leadership health. There's just no system. Any system can help or hurt, but there's no system that it brings 100% insurance against. And so you can always have systems that help, but you can't rely on them. At the end of the day, we're human. There's loopholes. There's matters of the heart. So when I talk to leaders, I think access, avoiding insulation, accountability. There has to be, Scot McKnight in his book, A Church Called Tov, talks a lot about loyalty. And I really agree with a lot of his conclusions about loyalty. but he's often describing personal loyalty to the person. And I think good, healthy teams, there's a loyalty to the mission first, and that always trumps personal loyalty, which means there's a level of accountability, like matters of ethics. There is no personal loyalty, right? And that has to be clear. So I think healthy teams have that level of accountability and feedback. But everything is an avoidance of complete black and white, because if you have nothing but feedback, you're never going to get anything done, right? Mm-hmm. Because you can always critique everything, and you can always have a second conversation about a decision before you make it. So I think those are some key things. One of the things I would say with leaders, that there has to be margin. Mm-hmm. If you don't have time to think strategically 3 years down the road, who else in your organization will, right? And so if you look back, like just say, everybody think about 15 months ago, whatever month that was when you're listening, what was really important that you accomplished that month? You know, for us right now, it'd probably be like October of 2019. What was so important that you did in October of 2019? You probably won't be able to say. And the truth is we spin our wheels on a lot of things in the moment and urgency. And so I think it goes back to a little bit of guarding, you know, knowing where you deliver the goods for your organization in ways that other people can't. Mm-hmm. Having the margin to be able to say yes to those things that further that, and guarding being able to say no. There's another phrase that's something about your success is more dependent upon what you say no to than what you say yes to. Mm-hmm. And that comes with clarity of, these are the ways that I'm bringing value to the organization, moving the ball down the field, whatever you want to use there, that other people can't. And so I'm going to make sure that I bring my A game there. So those types of things. I don't know. That's a list. That's almost a book you could write, 101 leadership axioms on leadership health. But those would be some of the ones that come to mind.
That's really good, man. Jesus said that, you know, a tree will be known by its fruit. And when the root system is decaying, eventually the fruit will decay as well. And sometimes we can have fruit from previous roots, and we're not paying attention to the root system. Yeah. And so I love that you model that when you work with a leader, you're really drilling down into that. For people who are interested in more information about Sean Morgan, the Ascent leader, and what you're doing, Leaders in Living Rooms, where should they go to get more info about what you're doing?
Yeah, so the core of what we do is cohorts. It's gathering leaders in a living room environment and creating conversation that goes deeper than you would get in a keynote or in a unidirectional sort of content-driven focus. And so that is at theascentleader.org. Everything we do there, you can access the cohorts that we're getting ready to start. You can see who the mentors are who really open up their homes and their lives and invite us in.
And those are mostly for church leaders at this point.
Everything is for church leaders. Yeah, it's focused on. We've got those for executive pastors. We've got those for main stage communicators. It's called Craft and Character. It's led by Steve Kotter. And then we've got the transition groups that I lead. So theascentleader.org is where you can find all that. For Leaders in Living Rooms, it's just anywhere there's podcasts. You can type in my name, Sean Morgan, or Leaders in Living Rooms, and you'll find that. And we've just been honored to steward so many great stories and conversations with that podcast.
That's awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for making the time to invest in us today. It's been a great honor to be with you. I've learned so much, and I love our conversation together today.
Likewise, honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for another bonus episode of the Echo Leadership Podcast. What a great conversation. What a great guy. Sean had so much wisdom to offer. So if you found it helpful, we want to encourage you to share it with somebody else. Thank you so much for those of you who have subscribed and liked. We're getting the word out. Our goal here is to help other leaders get better. We're going to help you get a little bit better every time we join together. So hopefully today's conversation did that. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Echo Leadership Podcast.